Our next speaker is Lizzie Tozer, who is Head of Market Intelligence for the Industrial Energy Transformation Fund at the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. She will provide an overview of the £289 million fund and showcase some of the technologies that it will support. Thank you. Over to Lily.
Thanks very much. So my name's Lily Tozer and I'm going to talk about the Industrial Energy Transformation Fund. I'll cover quite a lot of the detail for the fund so that you're prepared as an applicant if you're interested in applying for funding with all of the information that you might need around eligibility, how to apply. And my colleague Julia will be talking later on about some of the applicant support services that are available to you as well. The Industrial Energy Transformation Fund, or the IETF, has two main objectives. So we're looking to support industry to reduce its energy costs and emissions. And we're also hoping to bring down some of the costs and the risks associated with deep decarbonisation technologies by demonstrating that those technologies can work within an industrial site. And this fund was originally announced back in 2018. And we've been running now for just around 6 months. And the way that we've delivered the first phase of the fund is by working in partnership with Innovate UK and also the Knowledge Transfer Network. So BEIS delivered the first window in summer 2020, and we're now currently live with the spring 2021 window. Innovate UK will be our delivery partner, and the funding is available to applicants across England, Wales and Northern Ireland. We have £289 million to spend across those regions, and this funding is available out to 2024. As I mentioned, there'll be various competition windows for the fund, so ample opportunities hopefully for you to apply. The first of the funding windows closed last year in October 2020. And within that funding window, we were able to award 39 projects, spending around £31 million. All of those projects are still subject to further due diligence, so we're not able to talk at the moment about the successful awards, but we will be providing more information about some of those projects in due course. And the scope of that window is the same as the scope of the current window. That's phase 1, spring 2021, where we have £40 million to spend, and we opened around a month ago and will be closing on the 14th of July 2021 for applications. The funding that's available will cover energy efficiency deployment projects, as well as support for studies into energy efficiency and deep decarbonisation measures. Moving into later years, so towards the end of this year, we'll be opening up to also support deep decarbonisation deployment. So that will be what we call phase 2 of the fund. The reason for delaying spending for deep decarbonisation measures is that we recognise that some of those technologies, such as carbon capture, hydrogen, or fuel switching, are less well developed. They can be quite complex, and there's long lead-in times in order to develop some of the applications and the projects. So that's why we're hoping to give you a bit of time to think about what you might want to do, come and talk to us as well, and prepare those business cases. So to talk a bit more about exactly what we will support, I mentioned that we'll cover the costs of feasibility and engineering studies. And what I mean by that is essentially any of the work that you might want to do prior to making an investment decision on bringing in a new technology to your site. So applicants can claim for the costs of carrying out feasibility and engineering studies that would investigate an eligible technology. All of the scope of the work would need to be within an eligible site, and I'll talk about what that means in a bit more detail. And that site would need to be carrying out an industrial process that falls within our eligible categories. The same applies for energy efficiency deployment projects, but here the funding rules are slightly different. So we would be able to support you towards the costs that are directly associated with achieving an energy efficiency improvement. So if the sole purpose of the project that you'd like to carry out is to achieve energy efficiency savings, for example, you might want to install a heat recovery unit, then we would be able to support the costs of that project. If you're updating an existing piece of equipment, then what we would ask you to do is isolate the costs that are specifically associated with energy efficiency. So that could be, for example, the difference in costs between a standard like-for-like replacement of that equipment versus a replacement with a more up-to-date, top-of-the-end piece of equipment that would deliver those energy savings. And we'll provide the support through grant funding. So that would be for both studies and for deployment projects. And the amount of grant funding that you can receive will depend on the size and location of your company. So for deployment projects, for example, a large company could typically receive 30% of the eligible costs through grant funding, but that would increase as a percentage depending on the size of your company. We do encourage people to ask for the minimum grant that would be needed in order to get some of these projects across the line. So you'll be judged on the value for money of your proposal. And there are some thresholds as well that would define the minimum and maximum amount that you can claim through your application. That's set out in this table here. One thing to highlight is that the minimum thresholds here for energy efficiency deployment projects refer to the grant value that you can claim. So it must be the case that the amount of money that you're requesting is at least £100,000. And then the minimum amount for studies is 50,000 and 30,000, but that refers to the total cost of achieving that study on your site. So the grant that you're asking for might be lower than that. And to determine your eligibility for the fund, I mentioned that the fund is open to applicants across England, Wales, and of course, more importantly for this session, Northern Ireland. If you are interested in applying, then you must carry out an eligible category of industrial activity. And we use standard industrial classification codes to define those categories of activity. You'll be registered with a standard industrial classification code on Companies House, and that will normally start with 2 digits, followed by a few more that will identify what type of activity you carry out. Our fund is focused on manufacturing sector, so that's SIC codes 10 through to 33, and also data centres. But recognise that sometimes it's the case that your Companies House registration or indeed the registration of your parent company might not align to the activity that you carry out on site. If that's the case, that's no problem at all. We just encourage you to get in touch with us, explain what kind of activity your site carries out, and justify whether or not it falls in the scope of the activities that we've defined here. A few more things to point out in terms of eligibility as well is that we can support, and we aim to support through the objectives of our fund, the decarbonising and improved efficiency of existing sites. So if you're looking to set up a new plant, unfortunately in this case the ITF wouldn't be able to support you. The ITF has a broad remit, so in terms of the sectors I mentioned, that covers the whole of the manufacturing sector as well as data centres, and we apply a similar approach to technologies as well. And our eligibility rules are guided by a few principles. So firstly, you'll need to demonstrate that whatever technology you're choosing to employ is going to reduce energy use or carbon emissions from an existing industrial process where those benefits can be accounted for at site level. Project should align with our net zero goal for 2050. So that goes back to some of the things that Hannah was talking about previously. So really you should be able to show that your project in some way aligns to 2050, and really what we're hoping to avoid there is any lock-in of technologies that in 5, 10, 15 years time might not be delivering emissions and energy consumption at the levels we would expect. And finally, we're a transformation fund, so we won't support projects where there's already support available or where payback rates on that technology are already very low and therefore quite affordable. What we're looking to do is support some of those more novel, difficult, costly projects that you wouldn't be able to invest in with your own resources. And we take a technology and neutral approach within all of this. So I will talk about some of our eligibility rules in more detail, but essentially we recognise that you as a company will know what the most appropriate measures are for your site, and therefore we want to be guided by the kinds of technologies that you suggest to us are most likely to work for your industrial process. We are focused as a fund on the deployment of technologies. So you might be looking at a study or a deployment project, but in either case, we're hoping to support you in rolling out that technology long term and using it on your site. And that means that we're looking at relatively mature technologies that are defined as technology readiness levels of 7 and above for decarbonisation projects and 8 and above for energy efficiency projects. If you do have a proposal or you are a technology supplier or innovator that has some interesting technology that would achieve energy efficiency or decarbonisation benefits, but it's not yet at that technology readiness level, then you might want to consider some of the innovation funds that are available, which again I'll come to later. And I'll just give a slight overview of what kinds of technologies you might consider applying for. So first of all, energy efficiency technologies will be supported through both the deployment and the study strand of the competition. And the kinds of technologies that would be relevant there would include things such as energy use optimization and recovery. So you might be looking to optimize the control of your process on site so that you can reduce your energy consumption and manage it. So we'd support you in installing new monitoring equipment and control equipment, for example. We'd also help you to install heat recovery units or any of the additional equipment that might be needed in order to recover waste pressure, waste heat, etc. And also to invest in new, more efficient versions of your equipment, where again, you could show that investing in that level of equipment wouldn't have been affordable with your own budgets. And we'll also support fuel switching through the energy efficiency strand of the competition. And again, the rationale behind the fuel switch must be to achieve energy savings. So that's what you will be judged on in terms of the benefits of your proposal. And here we're looking at fuel switches that are eligible being from fossil fuels to the gas grid or from any fuel to electricity. And really the test, and this will apply for decarbonisation studies as well, is that the fuel you're switching to must be less carbon intensive than your previous fuel and no more carbon intensive than the gas grid. I also wanted to highlight some of the technologies that aren't eligible for the fund, as these are things that I know there's a lot of interest in, but unfortunately we can't support. So for the energy efficiency side of the competition, we can't support combined heat and power upgrades. The reason for that is really that there is other support available through the CHP Quality Assurance Programme, which will offer you subsidies towards some of the other subsidy and tax measures that are apply to your businesses in this space. We also won't support measures that would improve the efficiency of your building. And again, that's because other support measures are in place, and we're specifically focused on measures that apply to the industrial process, where we know that there are some quite hard to abate processes, and that's what we want to help with. So to pick out some decarbonisation technologies that would be eligible, this would include carbon capture applications. So this might be a proposal that you are looking to capture carbon on a flue on your site, and then either store and use that carbon or perhaps transport it through a future developing carbon transport route. We would support you to do any of the feasibility or engineering work, pre-engineering work that you might need to do through a study on site. We'll also support fuel switching. And again, the key test here is that you're switching away from a more carbon intensive fuel to a fuel that is no more carbon intensive than the gas grid. We will allow you to switch to biomass under the decarbonisation strand of the competition, as well as waste, hydrogen and biogas, but there are some specific caveats around that I'll explain, as well as the gas grid and electricity. And CHP with fuel switching is eligible in this strand as a decarbonisation measure. I mentioned the rules around biomass, and the test here is really that if you are using biomass, then you must show that it's the most appropriate measure for your site. So there wouldn't have been other decarbonisation routes that would have been appropriate, that the source of the biomass is sustainable, and also that you are using biomass in a high temperature application, so above 240 degrees Celsius. For biogas, we are similarly quite restrictive around eligibility. So in this case, biogas will only be supported where it's on an off-gas grid site, and where the biogas source is a dedicated supply that you can prove via evidence in your application. And again, there are some ineligible technologies that I'd like to highlight. So unfortunately, through this competition, we won't support energy supply measures. So that would include, for example, the installation of renewables like wind turbines, solar panels. And we also won't support the costs of linking to local or national grids. The IETF also doesn't support any infrastructure or equipment that might be needed in order to produce fuels. So this would include generation of hydrogen, biogas and biofuels, for example. And then finally on applications, so you are able to aggregate multiple proposals within one application, provided they are all on the same site and relate to the same strand of the competition. So for example, if you have multiple studies that investigate different technology types on your site, you could aggregate that into one application. Similarly, if you have multiple energy efficiency measures that you'd like to deploy, then you can aggregate those. And that might be helpful, for example, if you have various measures that are all underneath the threshold that we've set for the minimum grant funding amount. All of the proposals that you submit to us will be judged as one application. So I really stress that it's good to make sure that all of the components of that application are eligible. They're a good quality proposal. And that means that I really encourage you to come and talk to us. So through some of the support services that will be mentioned later to check that that's the case. Thank you very much for listening in to a bit of detail about the IETF. We really encourage applications. We're currently live and really keen to support businesses in Northern Ireland to decarbonise and reduce their energy bills.
Thank you, Lily, for highlighting the scope and technologies to be supported by the Industrial Energy Transformation Fund and information on the various funding calls. In the next session, we will highlight the support for decarbonisation, and we will welcome back Lily Tozer to discuss national funding programmes.
I wanted to touch briefly on some of the wider base funding that is available. Much of this will be included in the Industrial Decarbonisation Strategy documents that Hannah mentioned, and also within the 10-point plan that was published late last year and the Energy White Paper also published by BEIS. These documents set out sort of the whole package of funding that is available and will be available in future. And one of those funding opportunities that I particularly wanted to mention is the Net Zero Innovation Portfolio Programme. This is a 1 billion fund that's going to support technologies to become commercially ready. So if you have a technology that is at an earlier stage of development or might be novel, for example, in its first use within Northern Ireland or the rest of the devolved administrations, then you might want to consider whether any of the funds available through the portfolio would be relevant to you. These will be launching from later this year over the next few years, and we'll have several priority areas, including offshore wind, nuclear advanced modular reactions, hydrogen, building measures and industrial fuel switching. So we really hope that the IETF would be able to work alongside these funds in taking some of those early stage technology innovations through to being fully commercialised and used on industrial sites. And if you do have any interest in any of those competitions, all of the information is available online and we can share as well. Alongside the innovation funding, we'll also be opening up more deployment competitions. So this will include measures to support hydrogen across the UK. and ultimately that's to support the government's ambition to build up 5 gigawatts of capacity by 2030 for hydrogen production. Part of this funding will include a low carbon hydrogen production fund, which will have £240 million to spend out to 2024-2025, and more details of that will be available in due course. We'll also be bringing forward details in 2021 of revenue mechanisms that would support businesses to invest in the transport networks and other pieces of equipment that might be needed in order to realise carbon capture technologies and hydrogen technologies on their sites and within their local areas. This will all be available in due course, and we'll make sure that it's publicised to you.
Thank you, Lily.